You know what it feels like to hear the person you love call you too much when they think you can't hear them? I stood outside Seth's council chamber last Thursday, the mahogany doors I'd never been invited past, listening to my own name dissolve into laughter. 6 months of late-night conversations in his Billings penthouse. 6 months of learning how to make a 400-year-old vampire lord remember what joy felt like. 6 months of being the woman he visited after dark, but never mentioned in daylight. "Jennifer's lovely," he said to his inner circle, his voice carrying that careful dismissiveness I'd convinced myself was protection. But exhausting. Too attached. Too human. Too much. The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through everything I'd built around us. I'd spent half a year making myself essential to his existence, present enough to matter, small enough not to inconvenience the empire he'd built on control and distance. If you've ever been someone's secret joy but public burden, this story knows exactly where you're breaking. The museum in Billings was half empty that October afternoon. I remember because I'd gone there to escape the departmental meeting that had run 2 hours past bearable, professors arguing about syllabus revisions like they were drafting constitutional amendments. The Montana Historical Society had a traveling exhibit on Western mythology, and I needed to breathe air that didn't taste like academic posturing. I was standing in front of a display about frontier vampire legends when he spoke. "They got it all wrong, you know." His voice came from behind me, smooth, amused, carrying centuries of knowing things other people had only guessed at. I turned, saw him, and something in my chest recognized him before my mind caught up. He was beautiful in that way that makes you forget to breathe properly. Dark hair swept back from a face too precise to be accidental, eyes that shifted between gray and something deeper, depending on the light. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my semester salary, and he looked at the exhibit like he was reading his own poorly written biography. "Oh," I said, recovering enough to remember I had a voice. "And you're an expert on 19th century Montana vampire folklore?" "Something like that." He stepped closer, reading the placard that claimed vampires feared running water and couldn't cross thresholds uninvited. Though I'd argue the threshold thing is more about manners than mysticism. Nobody likes an uninvited guest. I should have known then. Should have recognized the way he spoke about vampires, like he was correcting gossip about old friends. But I was 30 years old and practical and had spent my entire adult life studying literature. I knew the difference between metaphor and reality. Or I thought I did. "So, what did they get wrong?" I asked, curious despite myself. He gestured to the display. "The fear. They make it sound like vampires are afraid of humans, running water, garlic, crosses. As if immortality comes with a list of inconvenient allergies." He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt that gaze settle somewhere deeper than comfortable. "The truth is simpler. We're not afraid of you. We're afraid of needing you. There's a difference." "We?" I raised an eyebrow. "I didn't realize you were speaking for the vampire community." "Community might be generous. We're not particularly good at cooperation." His smile was slight, genuine. "I'm Seth." "Jennifer." I shook his offered hand, cool skin, firm grip, the kind of touch that lingered half a second longer than professional. "And unless you're about to tell me you're actually 400 years old and undead, I'm going to assume you're a folklore enthusiast with a flair for dramatic first-person narratives. Would you believe me if I told you?"
"No." "Good."
"I prefer women who don't believe everything they're told." He released my hand, but didn't step back. "Are you always this direct with strangers in museums?" "Only when they interrupt my exhibits with revisionist vampire history." He laughed. Actually laughed, the kind of sound that seemed surprised by its own existence, like he'd forgotten what genuine amusement felt like. "I like you, Jennifer, the literature professor who doesn't believe in vampires." "How did you know I was a professor?" He gestured to my bag where my university ID was clipped to the strap. "Context clues. Also, you have that look." "What look?" "The one that says you spend your days explaining symbolism to undergraduates who think Twilight is classic literature." I couldn't help it. I smiled. "That's disturbingly accurate." We walked through the rest of the exhibit together. He pointed out historical inaccuracies with the confidence of someone who'd lived through the periods being described. I challenged his interpretations with literary analysis he clearly hadn't considered before. We argued about whether Dracula was a cautionary tale about immigration or imperialism. He told me Bram Stoker had terrible taste in wine. By the time we reached the museum exit, the sun was setting over the Yellowstone River, painting the city in shades of amber and rust. "I don't suppose you'd let me buy you dinner?" Seth asked, his hands in his pockets, that careful casualness that suggested the question mattered more than his tone implied. I should have said no. Should have recognized that men who seem too good to be true usually are. Should have noticed the way he stood just outside the direct sunlight streaming through the glass doors. Instead, I said yes. That night, we sat in a corner booth at a restaurant I'd never heard of, the kind of place that doesn't advertise because the right people already know about it. He ordered wine that tasted like poetry. I ordered food he didn't touch, and when I asked why he wasn't eating, he said he'd had a late lunch. Another thing I should have questioned. Didn't. We talked for 4 hours. About literature and history, and the difference between living through time and merely surviving it. He made me laugh with observations about modern life that only someone who'd seen centuries of human behavior could articulate. I made him pause mid-sentence twice, his expression shifting into something I couldn't quite name. "You're unusual," he said finally, watching me over his wine glass. "That's not typically a compliment. It is the way I mean it." He set down his glass. "Most people want something from me. You just want to argue about whether Shakespeare actually wrote his own plays." He definitely did. "And if you suggest otherwise, I'm leaving." "Even if I told you I met him once?" "Especially then. Nobody who actually met Shakespeare would question the authorship. He was insufferable about his genius." Seth smiled, that rare, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "How would you know?" "Because all real geniuses are. It's part of the package." When he finally walked me to my car, the city had gone quiet around us. Montana autumn nights carry a particular kind of cold, sharp enough to wake you up, gentle enough to make you want to stay outside just a little longer. "Can I see you again?" he asked. I looked at him standing there in the parking lot, backlit by streetlights, more beautiful and unknowable than anyone I'd ever met. Every reasonable part of my brain said this was complicated. Said men like him didn't just appear in museums and want women like me. "Yes," I said anyway. He kissed me then, soft and certain, and tasting like 400 years of knowing exactly how to make a moment feel eternal. I didn't know yet that eternal was exactly what he was. Didn't know that this beginning, this perfect, impossible beginning, was already teaching me how to love someone in shadows. But I would learn. God, I would learn. The first 3 months were the kind of beautiful that makes you forget to ask questions. Seth would appear at my apartment after dark, never before sunset, always after the city had settled into its evening rhythm. He'd bring wine I couldn't pronounce and books I'd mentioned wanting to read, first editions he claimed to have lying around, and we'd talk until 3 a.m. about everything and nothing. He'd listen to me dissect Victorian literature with the kind of attention that made me feel like every word I said mattered. Like I was the most fascinating thing he'd encountered in 4 centuries of existence. I told myself the timing didn't mean anything, that he was busy during the day, that powerful men kept unusual hours. I was so good at telling myself things that weren't true. He made love to me like he was trying to memorize every inch of my skin. Slow and deliberate and utterly focused, his cool hands learning the geography of my body with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Afterward, he'd hold me in the dark of my bedroom and tell me stories about places he'd been, careful never to mention when. I'd fall asleep against his chest, listening to the absence of a heartbeat I'd trained myself not to notice. By month 4, I loved him in that way that rewrites your entire internal landscape. The kind of love that makes you rearrange your schedule around someone else's availability. I started declining dinner invitations with colleagues because Seth might come by. Stopped making evening plans because I didn't want to miss him. My entire life began to orbit around the hours between sunset and dawn, and I told myself it felt like magic. It felt like disappearing, but I called it magic. I asked to meet his friends in February. We were lying in my bed, my head on his shoulder, his fingers tracing absent patterns on my arm. I'd like to meet the people in your life, I said, keeping my voice light. Casual. Like it didn't matter even though it did. Your friends. Your world. His hand stilled. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to feel the shift. My world isn't particularly interesting, he said finally. A lot of business associates. Territorial politics. You'd be bored. Let me decide what bores me. Jennifer. He kissed the top of my head, and I felt the deflection in the gentleness. You're the part of my life that isn't about all that. You're the part that feels human. I don't want to contaminate that with centuries of complicated history. I should have pressed. Should have asked why loving me meant keeping me separate. Should have recognized that contaminate was a strange word choice for introducing your girlfriend to your friends. Instead, I let it go. Told myself he was protecting me. That his world was probably complicated in ways I didn't understand. That being his refuge was romantic, not reductive. God, the things I told myself. By month 5, I started noticing the patterns. He never mentioned me in phone calls I could overhear. Never suggested we go anywhere public during evening hours when the city was alive with people who might know him. When I asked about attending a gallery opening he'd mentioned, something his business associates were hosting, he smiled and said it would be deadly boring, and wouldn't I rather spend the evening somewhere more intimate? I wore the word intimate like armor. Told myself privacy was precious. That not everyone needed to broadcast their relationship. That some love was more powerful for being quietly held. But late at night, after he'd left and I was alone again, I'd lie awake and wonder why none of my friends had met him. Why I had no photos of us together. Why I could describe every inch of his body but couldn't tell anyone where he worked or where he lived or anything about his life that didn't happen in the dark of my apartment. I was becoming a secret I was keeping from myself. In March, one of his phones rang while we were together. He had 3 phones and I'd stopped asking why. He answered it, and I heard a woman's voice on the other end, formal and deferential, mentioning something about a gathering at his estate. I'll be there, he said, his eyes on me, his voice carefully neutral.
No, alone.
It's not that kind of evening. He hung up. Didn't explain. Didn't offer to bring me. I didn't ask. That's the thing about loving someone in shadows. You learn not to ask for sunlight. You tell yourself you don't need it. That you're different. That your love is the kind that doesn't require witnesses or validation or any of the normal markers of being chosen. You learn to be grateful for what you're given and not to notice what you're not. By month 6, I was fluent in the language of my own erasure. I'd stopped mentioning him to my colleagues. Stopped posting anything on social media that might prompt questions about my personal life. I existed in 2 separate worlds. The visible one where I was Professor Brittany, who taught 19th century literature and lived alone, and the invisible one where I was the woman Seth visited after dark. I told myself I preferred it that way. That I'd never been someone who needed public validation. That intimacy was more important than visibility. But there were moments, small, sharp moments, when I'd catch sight of myself in the mirror and not quite recognize the woman looking back. Someone who'd learned to make herself smaller. Someone who'd accepted being loved in secret and called it special. Someone who was so afraid of being too much that she'd agreed to be nothing at all. If you've ever been the woman someone loved in secret, you already know how this feels. How it sits in your chest like something breaking slowly. There are more stories like this, about women who stopped shrinking themselves and men who didn't notice until it was too late. But they're easy to miss if you don't know where to look. I just didn't know yet that the breaking had already started. That by the time I heard what Seth really thought of me, I'd already taught him exactly how much of myself I was willing to erase to keep him. I wasn't supposed to be there that early. Seth had finally invited me to his estate. Not inside, not really. Just to meet him there after his evening obligations were finished. He'd given me the address with that careful casualness he used when offering me pieces of his world, like he was doing me a favor by letting me know where he lived. I should have recognized the gift for what it was. Conditional. Controlled. Just enough access to make me feel seen, without actually being visible. But I was so grateful for the invitation that I arrived 30 minutes early, my heart doing that stupid hopeful thing it did whenever Seth gave me anything that felt like progress. The estate was exactly what I'd imagined. Old money and older power, a restored Victorian mansion in the historic district where Billings kept its secrets. The kind of place that announced you didn't just have wealth, you had history. The front door was unlocked. He told me to let myself in, wait in the sitting room. I stepped inside, and the house swallowed me. All dark wood and darker silence, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. That's when I heard the voices. They were coming from behind a set of mahogany doors down the hall, partially open, light spilling into the corridor. I should have announced myself. Should have called out, made noise, done anything except what I did. I stood there, listening. The Portland Treaty needs revision before summer. A woman's voice, clipped and efficient. Someone used to being heard. The werewolf clans are positioning for territorial expansion, and if we don't establish clear boundaries now. Rowan handles Portland. Seth's voice cut through, and my chest tightened just hearing him. 6 months, and his voice still did that to me. Still made everything else feel less important. He'll manage the clans. What about the Chicago situation? Deteriorating. A man this time, older sounding, weary. The youngest families are questioning your authority. They say you've grown distracted. Silence. The kind that has weight. Distracted. Seth repeated the word like he was tasting it, deciding if it was accurate. That's one way to put it. Someone laughed. Low and knowing. The human, the woman said, and my blood went cold. Jennifer, isn't it? How long has that been going on now? I stopped breathing. 6 months. Seth's voice was neutral. Careful. Give or take. She's lovely. The woman again, and I could hear the smile in her voice. The kind of smile that's sharpening a knife. Very earnest. Does she know what you are yet, or are we still playing pretend? She knows enough. Seth's tone shifted, became dismissive in a way I'd never heard directed at me. Never heard at all. And it's not relevant to court business, Vivian. Of course not. Vivian's voice dripped something that wasn't quite kindness. Though I have to ask, how much longer are you planning to indulge this? You've been seen leaving her apartment at all hours. The younger vampires are starting to talk. It's becoming unseemly. I handle my private life as I see fit. But that's just it, isn't it? The older male voice, gentle but pointed. It's not entirely private anymore. You're 400 years old, Seth. You're the ranking lord in a 6-state territory. Your choices reflect on all of us. And this particular choice. What about this particular choice, Warren? Seth's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Warren sighed. She's mortal. Human. Temporary by definition. And from what Vivian tells me, she's becoming attached. Asking questions. Wanting more than you're prepared to give. I pressed my hand against the wall. Steadied myself. Jennifer's lovely, Seth said, and I heard my own name in his mouth and wanted to die. Truly. She's intelligent and challenging, and she makes me remember what it felt like to be human. But yes, she's exhausting. Too attached. Too human. Too much. The words landed like physical blows. Someone laughed. Actually laughed. And Seth didn't defend me. Didn't correct them. Didn't say a single thing to contradict the assessment that I was a lovely inconvenience. A temporary distraction. Too much. So, what's the plan? Vivian asked. Let it run its course? Wait for her to age out of being interesting. I haven't decided yet. Seth's voice was tired now. Bored almost. For now, she's compartmentalized. She doesn't come to court. Doesn't interfere with business. As long as that remains true, I don't see the harm in letting her think this is something more than it is. Letting her think. The floor tilted. I put my hand over my mouth, trapping the sound that wanted to escape. You're getting soft, Warren said, but there was affection in it. The Seth I knew 2 centuries ago wouldn't have bothered with explanations. He'd have just turned her, or left her. The Seth you knew 2 centuries ago hadn't learned that some pleasures are better savored than consumed. Seth's voice held that dry humor I'd fallen in love with. Jennifer serves a purpose. She reminds me what warmth feels like. But she's not. She could never be part of this world. She's too fragile for it. Too breakable. Too human, Vivian echoed. Exactly. I stood there in the hallway of a house I'd never been invited into, listening to the man I loved explain to his court exactly how little I meant. How neatly I'd been filed away in his existence. How temporary I was. How easy it would be to let me go when I finally became more trouble than I was worth. I'd made myself so small for him. Had convinced myself that being his secret was the same as being his choice. That privacy was intimacy. That the hours between sunset and dawn were enough. And the whole time, I was just, what had Vivian called it? An indulgence. A distraction. Something he hadn't decided whether to keep. I didn't confront him. Didn't throw open those mahogany doors and demand an explanation or an apology, or anything at all. I just stood there absorbing the truth I'd been too afraid to see. I'd spent 6 months teaching Seth exactly how much of myself I was willing to sacrifice to keep him. And he'd learned the lesson perfectly. I was too much and not enough, all at the same time. I turned around, walked back through that silent house, closed the front door so carefully it barely made a sound. And by the time Seth came looking for me 20 minutes later, I was already gone. I packed in the dark. Not because I needed to hide what I was doing, but because turning on the lights felt like admitting this was real. That I was actually leaving. That's 6 months of love, or what I called love, could fit into 2 suitcases and a carry-on bag. My hands didn't shake. That was the strange part. I thought they would. Thought I'd fall apart, cry, question whether I was overreacting to words I wasn't meant to hear. But I was 30 years old, and I'd learned a long time ago that the clearest thinking happens in the aftermath of heartbreak. When the shock hasn't worn off yet, but the truth has already settled into your bones. Too attached. Too human. Too much. I repeated the words to myself like a mantra while I folded clothes, packed books, emptied my bathroom of the things that made it mine. Each repetition made them smaller. Less devastating. By the 3rd suitcase, they were just sounds. By the time I loaded everything into my car, they meant nothing at all. I didn't leave a note. Didn't text. Didn't do any of the things that would give him an opening to explain or apologize or convince me I'd misunderstood. Because I hadn't misunderstood. That was the gift of overhearing instead of being told. You get the unedited version. The truth people tell when they think you're not listening. I blocked his number before I left my apartment. All 3 of them. Blocked his email. His social media, not that he used it much, but still. I erased him from every platform where he could reach me with the methodical precision of someone who knew exactly how persuasive he could be if I gave him the chance. Then I drove. Montana to Portland is 16 hours if you don't stop much. I did it in 14, fueled by gas station coffee and the particular clarity that comes from realizing you've been complicit in your own erasure. I didn't cry. Didn't call friends. Didn't do anything except drive through the night while the mountains gave way to plains, gave way to forests, each mile putting distance between me and the woman who'd made herself small enough to love a man who thought she was too much. Portland in April smells like rain and new starts. I found a sublet through a university colleague who'd relocated there the year before, a 1-bedroom apartment in the Pearl District with hardwood floors and windows that faced east. Morning light. I'd forgotten what that looked like. Spending 6 months calibrating my life around someone who only existed after sunset. I started over with the kind of quiet determination you develop when you're old enough to know that drama doesn't heal you. Distance does. I contacted the university about visiting professor positions. Updated my CV, reached out to colleagues I'd been neglecting because Seth might call. I rebuilt my life with the same care I'd used to dismantle it, piece by piece, until I could look in the mirror and recognize the woman staring back. She wasn't the woman who'd loved Seth. She was the woman who'd loved herself enough to leave him. Seth called on day 3. I was unpacking books when my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. He'd gotten a new phone, apparently, one I hadn't blocked yet. I watched it ring. Watched his name appear on my laptop, Email after email filling my blocked folder where I couldn't see them but knew they were accumulating. I didn't answer, didn't read, didn't engage. On day 5, he showed up at my old apartment in Billings. I know because my neighbor texted me. A man had been there, she said, looking confused and increasingly agitated. He knocked on my door for 20 minutes. Left something on the doorstep. Came back the next night and did it again. Do you want me to call the police? She asked. No, I texted back. Just ignore him. He'll stop eventually. But he didn't stop. Week 2, the gifts started arriving at my department in Portland. I'd listed my new affiliation on my university profile, and of course Seth would find it. First editions of books I'd mentioned loving. Jewelry I'd never asked for. A handwritten letter I didn't open, just added to the box under my bed where I was collecting all the evidence of his 2 late attempts at proving I mattered. My department secretary started recognizing the delivery service. Your boyfriend really misses you, she said, smiling like it was romantic.
He's not my boyfriend, I said.
And I don't want any of it. Send it all back. She stopped smiling. Week 3, Seth called my office. I don't know how he got the number. Actually, I do know. He was 400 years old with resources I couldn't imagine and a territory that spanned 6 states. Finding one literature professor's office number was probably the easiest thing he'd done all week. I answered before I could think better of it. Jennifer.
His voice was raw, desperate.
Nothing like the controlled, dismissive tone I'd heard in his council chamber. Where are you? Why won't you talk to me? What happened? I could have told him. Could have explained exactly what I'd heard and how it felt to realize you've been someone's lovely distraction while thinking you were their future. Could have given him the closure of knowing why. Instead, I said, I don't want to see you anymore, Seth. Please stop calling. That's it. His voice cracked. Actually cracked. 6 months and you're just what, done? Without even a conversation. We had our conversation. You just didn't know I was listening. Silence. Long enough that I thought he might have hung up. You were at the estate, he said finally, understanding settling into his voice like stones in deep water. I was. Jennifer, let me explain. There's nothing to explain. You told them exactly what you think of me. Too attached. Too human. Too much. I kept my voice steady, clinical, the same tone I used when discussing theme and symbolism with undergraduates. The only thing I needed to understand was that you meant it. And I do. So now I'm choosing to be somewhere I'm not any of those things. Somewhere I'm just enough. You are enough. You're. I hung up, blocked the new number, added it to the list. That night, I sat on my apartment floor surrounded by boxes I hadn't finished unpacking and finally cried. Not because I missed him, though I did. God, I did, but because I was grieving the woman who'd loved him. The one who'd convinced herself that being someone's secret was the same as being someone's choice.
She was gone now.
Left behind in a Billings apartment along with everything else I didn't need anymore. And for the first time in 6 months, I wasn't anyone's secret. I was just mine. I didn't know Seth was unraveling until my neighbor mentioned the man who stood across the street at 3 a.m. Same guy. 3 nights this week, Mrs. Kozlov said, her Russian accent thick with concern. She lived in the unit below mine and had adopted me the way lonely elderly women adopt stray cats, with food and unsolicited advice and a fierce protectiveness I hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Just standing there in the dark, watching her windows. You have stalker, Malaya. You call police. It's fine, I said, though my hands went cold. He's harmless. No man who stands in shadows is harmless. She gripped my arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. You are too young to know this, but I am not. Men who watch are men who are deciding. You be careful. I started closing my curtains at night, double-checking my locks, taking different routes home from the university. But I never called the police because what would I tell them? That a 400-year-old vampire lord was stalking me from a respectful distance? That he never approached, never threatened, just existed in my peripheral vision like a ghost I'd loved and left behind? The gifts kept coming. Weekly now, then daily.
Books. Jewelry.
Once, a first edition of Wuthering Heights that probably cost more than my annual salary, accompanied by a note in his handwriting. You said Heathcliff and Catherine were idiots who destroyed themselves with their own stubbornness. You were right. I returned that one too. Added the note to the box under my bed that was getting heavier with evidence of his desperation. My colleagues started asking questions I didn't want to answer. The department secretary stopped making romantic comments about persistent admirers. Even my students noticed. Professor Brittany, are you okay? You seem distracted. And I realized I'd been teaching Victorian literature while actively living out my own Gothic tragedy. 2 months after I left Montana, my university colleague in Billings called. Jennifer, I don't know how to say this gently, so I'm just going to say it. Her voice was tight with something between concern and fear. Seth Raines came to my office asking about you. Wanted to know if I'd helped you relocate. If I knew where you were living. He wasn't aggressive, but he wasn't right either. Like something in him was barely holding together. What did you tell him? Nothing. But Jen, who is this man? What did he do to you? Nothing, I said, and it was true. He'd done nothing except show me exactly what I was worth to him. And everything.
Don't worry about it.
He'll stop eventually. But he didn't stop. 3 months in, I heard rumors from colleagues who had colleagues in Montana. Whispers about Seth Raines withdrawing from business deals. Missing important meetings. His associates were concerned. His behavior had become erratic. Someone said he'd fired his entire household staff in a rage when they couldn't locate a woman who'd worked for him briefly, except I'd never worked for him. I just loved him. For months in, I stopped thinking about him, every hour. Then every day. Then sometimes whole weeks would pass, when I didn't check my blocked messages or add returned gifts to the box under my bed, or wonder if he was standing across the street in the dark. I started rebuilding the parts of myself I'd dismantled to fit into his world. Accepted a tenure-track position at Portland State. Made friends who knew nothing about my past except that I'd relocated from Montana. Started running in the mornings because I could, because my life wasn't calibrated around someone else's nocturnal schedule anymore. 5 months in, I met Owen. He was human in every possible way, warm-blooded and present and utterly, refreshingly normal. A high school history teacher with kind eyes and terrible taste in coffee. We met at a faculty mixer neither of us wanted to attend, bonded over our shared hatred of academic small talk, and ended up getting dinner at a Thai restaurant where he ordered food he actually ate. Our first kiss tasted like pad Thai and possibility, like someone who wanted me in daylight, like being chosen without conditions. I really like you, Owen said on our third date, and there was no calculation in it. No careful management of how much to reveal. Just honest affection from a man who thought I was enough exactly as I was. I really like you too, I said and meant it. We took things slowly. He met my friends. I met his. We went to movies and farmers markets and did all the normal things that normal people do when they're building something real. He never asked why I was sometimes distant. Never pressured me to explain the boxes I wouldn't unpack or the curtains I kept closed or the way I flinched when someone stood too long outside my building. 6 months after leaving Montana, I laughed at something Owen said, really laughed, the kind that comes from your chest and means you've forgotten to be careful, and I realized I was happy. Actually happy. Not the intense, consuming, destructive kind of happiness I'd felt with Seth. Just the quiet, sustainable kind that comes from being with someone who sees you in full light and doesn't require you to be less. I didn't know Seth was watching from across the street when Owen kissed me goodnight. Didn't know he'd tracked my entire life in Portland with the obsessive attention of someone who'd realized too late what he'd lost. Didn't know his court was worried he'd finally, after 4 centuries, lost the control that had defined his entire existence. I didn't know any of it until the night he finally approached. Until he showed up at my door with 400 years of desperation in his eyes and offered me everything he should have given me when I'd still wanted it. But by then, I'd already learned the most important lesson of my life, that being someone's obsession after you leave is not the same as being their choice when you stay. And I'd spent 6 months learning how to be someone's choice. I wasn't going back to being someone's regret. He came on a Tuesday night in October, exactly 6 months and 11 days after I'd left Montana. I was grading papers at my kitchen table, NPR playing softly in the background, a cup of tea going cold beside my laptop. Owen had left an hour earlier. He had early classes on Wednesdays, and I was settled into the comfortable solitude of someone who'd learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. The knock was soft, hesitant. Nothing like the confident way Seth used to let himself into my old apartment, like he owned every space I occupied. I knew it was him before I opened the door. Some part of me had been waiting for this moment since the night I left. The final confrontation. The desperate plea. The moment when he'd finally offer everything I needed when needing it could have changed our story. He looked terrible. That was the first thing I noticed. Seth, who'd always been unnaturally composed, looked like he'd been coming apart slowly for months. His hair wasn't quite right. His clothes, expensive as always, hung differently, like he'd lost weight or forgotten how to care about appearances. His eyes were the worst part.
Wild.
Desperate. The kind of desperation that comes from someone who'd spent 400 years in control discovering that control was an illusion. Jennifer. My name in his mouth sounded like a prayer. Like something he'd been holding on to for so long it had worn grooves into his soul.
Please.
Please let me talk to you. I should have closed the door. Should have told him to leave. Should have done anything except what I did, which was step back and let him into my apartment, into the life I'd built without him. He stood in my living room, looking lost. Looking at the bookshelves I'd arranged, the photos on the walls, me with colleagues, me with Owen, me laughing in ways I'd never laughed in Montana. Evidence of a whole existence that didn't include him. You've been well, he said, and it wasn't a question. It was an observation that hurt him. I've been, he stopped. Started again. I haven't been well. At all. Not since you left. I didn't say anything. Just waited. Let him carry the weight of this conversation the way I'd carried the weight of our entire relationship. I was wrong. The words came out broken.
Raw.
Everything I said that night, everything you heard, I was wrong. You weren't too much. You were never too much. You were everything, and I was so terrified of needing you that I convinced myself you were the problem. That your wanting more was a flaw instead of, his voice cracked. Instead of you asking for what you deserved. Okay, I said calmly. Okay. He looked at me like I'd spoken a language he didn't understand. That's all you have to say? What do you want me to say, Seth? That I forgive you? That I understand? That 6 months of you falling apart somehow makes up for 6 months of me making myself small enough to fit into your life?
No. Yes.
I don't know. He ran his hands through his hair, that gesture I used to find endearing, and now just found sad. I want you to come back. To let me show you. I'll introduce you to everyone. Bring you to court. Make you part of my world the way I should have from the beginning. I'll give you everything you asked for. Everything I was too proud and too stupid and too afraid to offer when it mattered. There was a time when hearing those words would have fixed everything. Would have made all the hiding and the hurt feel worth it. Would have convinced me that love was patient, that waiting paid off, that men eventually came around if you just gave them enough space to realize what they'd lost. But I was 30 years old, and I'd learned that love isn't about waiting for someone to choose you. It's about choosing yourself first and finding someone who chose you all along. I needed you when needing you could have meant something, I said, and my voice was steady. Gentle, even. No anger. No tears. Just the calm truth of someone who'd already grieved this loss and come out the other side. I needed you when I was standing outside that council chamber, hearing you explain to your court how exhausting I was. I needed you the 100 times I asked to meet your friends, and you deflected. I needed you every single night. I made myself smaller, so you wouldn't have to deal with how much I loved you. I know. God, Jennifer, I know. But I'm here now. I'm ready now. Doesn't that count for something? It counts for everything. And nothing. I looked at him, this beautiful, broken, 400-year-old man who'd finally learned what it cost to lose someone, and I felt nothing but a distant sadness. You're ready now because I left. Because my absence broke something in you. But Seth, I don't want to be with someone who only values me when I'm gone. I want someone who valued me when I was there. I did value you.
No. You needed me.
There's a difference. I took a breath. I've met someone. Someone who introduces me to everyone he knows. Who posts pictures of us and brags about my work and doesn't think my wanting to be part of his life is exhausting. Someone who makes me feel like being too much is actually being exactly enough. I watched something die in Seth's eyes. Some last hope he'd been carrying that this was fixable. You love him, he said flatly. I'm learning too. And even if I didn't, even if I'd been completely alone these past 6 months, I still wouldn't come back. Because I finally learned how to love myself more than I loved the idea of being enough for you. So that's it. His voice was hollow. Empty. 6 months of my entire existence falling apart, and you've just moved on. Yes, I said simply. I have. I can't accept that. You don't have a choice. We stood there in my apartment, my space, my life, my carefully rebuilt existence, and I watched him process what it meant to be on the other side of a door that wouldn't open. To be the one left outside. To finally, after 4 centuries of people bending themselves into shapes that pleased him, encounter someone who'd rather be whole than wanted. I love you, he said, and he meant it. I could hear it in every syllable. Could see it in the way he looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. Jennifer, I love you. Doesn't that mean anything? It means everything, I said. And it's not enough. Not anymore. What can I do? Tell me what to do, and I'll. Let me be happy. My voice was soft but final. That's all. Just let me be happy, Seth. I walked to the door. Opened it. The hallway light spilled in, creating a threshold he'd have to cross to leave. He didn't move for a long moment. Just stood there looking at me like he was trying to memorize something he'd never properly seen before. I'm sorry, he whispered. For all of it. I'm so sorry. I know you are. Does it matter? That I'm sorry? It matters. It just doesn't change anything. He walked to the door. Stopped when he was close enough that I could feel the coldness coming off him, that supernatural chill I used to find exotic, and now just found sad. I'll always love you, he said. I hope you do, I said. I hope you remember this feeling every time you meet someone new. I hope you remember what it costs to love someone in secret. What it costs to realize too late that you had everything and called it too much. Then I closed the door. I didn't watch through the peephole. Didn't check to see if he left. Just went back to my kitchen table, my cold tea, my grating, my life. There are women who know what it means to walk away from love that only exists in the dark. Women who've chosen themselves even when it felt like tearing something vital out of their chest. If this story felt like yours, if you recognized yourself in Jennifer's quiet departure or Seth's desperate too late, there are others. Stories about reclaiming yourself from men who thought your love would wait forever. They exist in a space where women like you gather, where these truths are told without apology. You just have to make sure you don't lose them. Mrs. Kozlov told me later that a man stood outside my building until the sky started turning pink. Until the first hints of sunrise threatened to burn him if he stayed. That he looked up at my windows one last time before disappearing into the last of the darkness. I didn't ask if she called the police. Didn't ask what he looked like standing there. Didn't ask anything at all. Because I already knew the answer to the only question that mattered. Some disappearances are permanent, and the cruelest thing isn't being forgotten. It's being remembered by someone who can't have you back.